March 1943. Cold wind moves across Rechlin Airfield in Germany. Luftwaffe officers stand silent before a captured American bomber. The Flying Fortress. Silver and scarred, but still alive. One whispers softly, "How can any nation build thousands of these while fighting the world?" The question fades into the hum of distant engines. Engines cough, then roar alive. 4 propellers turn, slicing through the frozen air. Test pilot Hans Werner Lersche grips the controls. The bomber trembles, then rises into the gray sky. For a moment, even the Germans feel pride. They are flying the enemy's masterpiece, built with calm precision and strength. High above the clouds, silence becomes awe. Through clear glass turrets, metal glows like fire. 13 heavy machine guns point in every direction, each ready to fire hundreds of rounds each minute. Lurch whispers quietly, "This plane, it defends itself." And for the first time, German skies feel smaller. The bomber lands, engines fading into silence. Pilots step down slowly, eyes wide with disbelief. One murmurs softly, "This machine could change the war." If you enjoy calm, true stories of World War II, stay with us and subscribe for more forgotten missions. Because what they found inside this flying fortress would forever change how they saw victory. It began on a cold morning in December, 1942. Over the skies of occupied France, the American B-17, known as Wolfhound, carried 10 men into danger. They were young, tired, and already veterans of too many missions. Below them, the fields of Europe passed like shadows. The target was a railway yard near the city of Rouen. Nothing unusual, just another day in the air war. But the calm broke quickly. German fighters appeared out of the clouds, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, their guns flashing in the morning light. Bullets tore through the airframe. Engines screamed. Smoke filled the cockpit. The crew held on, praying the fortress would stay alive just long enough to reach friendly skies. Yet, each second made that hope smaller. The right engine failed first, then another. The bomber began to drift from formation. Alone in the sky, Wolfhound became a wounded giant. The pilot, Lieutenant Paul Flickinger, fought the controls. His hands were trembling, but steady. Below, the crew waited for the order. No one wanted to jump. The sea was too far, and so was home. Through a break in the clouds, Flickinger saw a wide green field near a small village called Malin. He lowered the landing gear, but the hydraulics were gone. The heavy bomber slid down through the mist, touching the earth with a scream of tearing metal. It came to rest in silence. The crew climbed out. 10 figures standing in the cold, hands raised to the gray sky, waiting for the enemy to arrive. Within hours, the Germans arrived. Soldiers surrounded the silent fortress, weapons drawn but cautious. It was rare to see an American bomber this intact. The officers circled it like hunters studying a great animal. Cameras clicked. Engineers whispered. One of them said quietly, "Do not touch anything. It is worth more than gold." They marked the field with ropes, brought trucks, tools, and guards. Every gun barrel, every wire, Every rivet was photographed. This was not a wreck. It was a treasure. As night fell, searchlights turned the field into a ghostly workshop. The captured bomber would soon be carried north to Rechlin to reveal its secrets, to teach Germany what it was truly up against. At dawn, the sound of engines echoed through the French countryside. Trucks rolled across the muddy field, carrying tools and guards. The bomber, heavy and silent, was prepared for transport. German engineers spoke in short sentences, careful, precise. Every cable, every wing joint was covered and secured. The flying fortress was no longer a wreck. It was a gift from the enemy, a miracle of survival. They moved it slowly, piece by piece, through villages that had never seen such a machine. Children watched from windows. Old men crossed themselves as it passed. By night, the convoy reached the rail lines. The Americans had built it to fly across oceans, but now it rode on a German train, bound for Rechlin, where men in uniforms waited to learn its secrets. 3 days later, the fortress arrived at the Luftwaffe testing base, Rechlin, north of Berlin, a place where captured planes came to speak. The bomber was rolled into a hangar filled with silence. Engineers gathered, notebooks in hand. Some smiled. Others shook their heads. They had never seen such precision, such order inside an aircraft built by strangers across the ocean. One officer placed his hand on the metal and whispered, "This is not just a bomber. This is an idea." Outside, snow began to fall, covering the runway like a page waiting to be written. The next chapter of its story was about to begin, where German pilots would fly the fortress themselves and discover a weapon unlike any they had ever known. At Rechlin, the air was colder, quieter. The captured bomber stood beneath hangar lights like a giant sleeping animal. German engineers moved carefully around it, their breath rising in the winter air. They spoke little, only the sound of pencils on paper, measuring, sketching, writing numbers. Each man realized they were standing inside a miracle of design, something built for endurance, not beauty. They opened the panels, studied the wings, touched the rivets. One man whispered, "Even the metal feels different." American engineers had built this fortress for war at 25,000 feet, and for survival against fire and steel. To the Germans watching, every bolt carried a message about a nation that had mastered mass production and believed that quantity could become a weapon of its own. The inspection began slowly, panel by panel. Every wire, every system was photographed, traced, and redrawn. The electrical network ran like veins through the aircraft. The hydraulic lines looked almost alive. German technicians compared each circuit to their own machines and found a philosophy entirely different. Simplicity, modular design, pieces built to fit without human touch. One engineer, older than the rest, sighed softly. "We build art, they build repetition." He meant it not as insult, but as recognition. What he saw inside the flying fortress was a language of industry that spoke of endless factories, of women at assembly lines, of workers who never met but built the same dream. The Germans had craftsmanship. The Americans had a system, and that system was winning the war. Days turned into nights, and still the engineers worked. The bomber's skin was peeled back like the layers of a great puzzle. They tested alloys, noted measurements, and whispered in low voices as they drew conclusions no one wanted to admit. This plane was not extraordinary because of genius, but because it could be built again and again, faster than the enemy could destroy it. One officer placed his hand on the fuselage and closed his eyes. He could feel the hum of a nation behind it, not the power of a single inventor, but of millions working together. The truth spread quietly through Rechlin. Germany could match its craftsmanship, but not its scale. And deep down, every man in that hangar knew what that meant. The day came when the engineers stepped aside. The mechanics checked the controls, the fuel, the balance of weight, and nodded. The bomber looked whole again, clean, powerful, ready to rise once more. German test pilot Hans-Werner Lersche climbed into the cockpit, his gloves touching American instruments. The engines coughed, then thundered to life, shaking the hangar walls. Outside, the air was sharp and still. As the Fortress moved along the runway, its silver wings caught the light of the winter sun. For a moment, the men watching forgot it was their enemy's machine. The takeoff was smooth, effortless. The flying fortress rose into the sky above Rechlin, and for the first time, a German hand guided it through the clouds. The fortress climbed higher, steady, calm. The controls answered like music, balanced and sure. Lurch moved through turns, tested the engines, then cut 1, 2. The bomber kept flying, strong and steady, as if it refused to fall. From the ground, the men watched in silence. They understood now. This was not just engineering. It was endurance made visible. When the flight ended, Lersche stepped out and removed his gloves. His face was pale, but his eyes were alive. "It flies like nothing we have," he said softly. Around him, the airmen were quiet, each man thinking the same thought. If this is only one plane, how many more are coming? And with that question, the story moved forward to the next chapter, where the fortress would be tested not by hands, but by fire. The hangar was silent except for the echo of footsteps and the faint hum of lights above. The captured flying fortress rested in the center, its silver skin reflecting the cold air like armor. Engineers moved carefully around it, their gloved hands brushing against smooth aluminum. The smell of oil, steel, and winter filled the vast room. Hans-Werner Lersche climbed into the cockpit slowly, as if entering a sacred place. Every lever, every dial, every switch was placed with reason, not decoration. He whispered to himself, "This is a machine built for endurance, not for comfort." The Germans had never built something like it. Their bombers required skill and instinct. This one required discipline and teamwork. It was not made for one man's talent, but for many hands working in perfect order. The more Lersche studied, the more he felt the weight of what he was touching. This was not just an aircraft. It was the embodiment of an industrial dream, a symbol of a nation that built power from repetition, not from pride. Morning light spilled through the hangar windows. The engineers returned with notebooks and cameras, tracing every wire, every line of code written in metal. They noted the layout, the cables, the oxygen lines that ran neatly along the walls, It was more than clever design. It was communication through simplicity. One man said quietly, "It looks like it was made to be understood by anyone." He was right. Every switch, every control seemed designed not for genius, but for clarity. In that realization lay something deeper. The Americans had created a machine that forgave mistakes, where logic replaced intuition, and procedure replaced art. The Germans prided themselves on craftsmanship. But here, they saw something more powerful, the idea that war could be won through organization alone. It was humbling to admit, but the fortress taught them more than any classroom could. It spoke of a world where precision came not from hands, but from systems. Days passed in slow rhythm. The bomber became a classroom, a quiet cathedral of engineering. The crew documented everything: the hydraulic systems, the gun positions, the emergency circuits, each built to function even when damaged. One engineer ran his hand along the aluminum ribs and said, "They built this for survival, not perfection." He was right. The fortress was not delicate. It was forgiving, a weapon designed to stay alive, even when the sky turned into fire. At night, the hangar was lit only by lanterns. The shadows stretched across the silver fuselage like ghostly wings. Lersch stood alone in the silence, writing his notes. The words came slowly, measured, precise. He was beginning to understand what made this bomber so different. It was not its guns or its armor. It was the system behind it. A factory that could build 1,000 more just like it. And that truth was far more terrifying than any weapon. The fortress sat quietly in the hangar, stripped open like a great book of steel. Each line of rivets, each plate of armor told a story. Engineers traced the bomber's veins, its fuel pipes, its oxygen systems, its electrical paths, and saw logic turned into art. There was no waste, no confusion, only balance. Each part had a reason. Each piece could be replaced in minutes. For the Germans, this was both admiration and humiliation. They realized how fast such planes could be built and rebuilt. Thousands of them, all identical. Where Germany created uniqueness, America created reliability. The engineers exchanged looks that said everything without words. The fortress was more than metal. It was a lesson in how a nation thinks and how it fights. That thought stayed with them, long after the hangar lights went dark. Hans Werner Lerche returned to the bomber one last time that winter. He sat in the cockpit, staring at the rows of gauges. The air smelled of oil and cold iron. He thought about the factories that built this machine, and the men who flew it through storms of fire. It was not perfect, but it was endless. He smiled faintly, knowing what that meant for the war and for history. He wrote one final note in his journal. Perfection is slow, but victory needs speed. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the bomber's wings, turning them gold. If you enjoy discovering the hidden truths behind World War II, subscribe to the channel and join us as we bring the unseen to life. Because next, this captured fortress will take to the sky again, and what it reveals will change how the Luftwaffe saw the war itself. By early spring of 1943, the fortress stood ready again, its engines polished, its turrets armed, its silver wings catching the weak sunlight above Rechlin. The Germans wanted answers. They needed to know how this flying fortress defended itself, how it created death from the sky. Engineers installed cameras, measured angles of fire, prepared the targets across the field. Every movement was documented, precise, methodical. Hans Werner Lerche would fly again, but this time not to admire, to challenge. He would feel the rhythm of its guns, the balance of its defense. As the bomber's engines thundered to life, snow lifted from the ground like smoke. Everyone watching knew this would not be an ordinary flight. This was not curiosity anymore. It was competition and silent fear. The engines roared as the bomber climbed into the cold sky. Below, German fighters followed, their cameras recording every move. The test had begun. At 10,000 feet, Lerche gave the signal, gunners loaded belts of ammunition, and the fortress came alive with thunder. The air filled with the metallic rhythm of 13 heavy guns, moving as one, forming an invisible cage of lead and fire. From below, pilots tried to approach, but the defensive pattern was relentless. No matter where they came from, the fortress answered. Every angle of attack was covered, each turret turning with mechanical precision. The Luftwaffe had never seen anything like it. It was not chaos. It was choreography, and the sky itself seemed to bend under the storm of gunfire. From the ground, the officers in the control tower watched through binoculars. The fortress moved like a creature alive, its turrets tracking invisible enemies with grace and precision. The radio crackled with reports, range tests, firing angles, heat buildup, but the officers barely spoke. They were watching something that felt beyond human, a machine that fought back, not by instinct, but by design. One colonel lowered his binoculars and said softly, "We cannot outfly this." The others stayed silent. Only the distant echo of gunfire filled the air. It was a strange moment, awe mixed with dread. They realized the enemy had built not just an aircraft, but a flying fortress in every sense of the word. And, for the first time, the Luftwaffe began to fear what mass production could truly mean. After the first flight, the gunners began their own tests. Each man was assigned a station, nose, tail, waist, and dorsal turrets, to record visibility, range, and motion. They climbed inside the fortress one by one, touching the cold handles, adjusting the seat belts that still smelled faintly of oil and smoke. The German airmen compared the American guns to their own, and what they found was unsettling. The design was not elegant, but it was built for survival. Every turret moved smoothly, powered by electric motors that hummed like breath. The sight lines covered every blind angle. There was nowhere to hide from the crossfire. A Luftwaffe gunner shook his head and said quietly, "This is a wall of bullets, not a plane." He was right. The fortress had turned defense into an art form, where every movement served protection, not pride. When the final test ended, the hangar fell quiet again. The engineers gathered around the table, their papers filled with numbers, ranges, velocity, impact marks. None of them spoke for a long time. They had seen enough. The fortress could defend itself from nearly every angle. It could fly with engines destroyed. It could keep fighting long after it should have fallen. The silence in the room was heavier than any explosion. Hans Werner Lerck looked at the diagrams and then out the hangar doors, where the bomber stood in the pale evening light. He thought of the pilots still fighting in the east, and knew they would never see a machine like this on their side. He closed his notebook and whispered, "We have met the future, and it is not ours." Outside, the fortress gleamed in the fading sun, ready for the next chapter, when its power would change the way the Luftwaffe fought in the skies above Europe. The reports from Rechlin spread quickly through Luftwaffe command. What they learned from the captured fortress changed everything. German pilots began rewriting their tactics, memorizing the blind spots, calculating attack angles, practicing in simulators with painted silhouettes of the American bomber. They learned that a direct approach was suicide. Frontal assaults meant flying into a storm of bullets. The only hope lay in speed and surprise. Officers studied the diagrams late into the night. The fortress had shown them what to fear and what to avoid. From now on, fighter wings would strike from above and below, never head-on. It was strange. They had captured the bomber to defeat it, but instead it had taught them to respect it. In its silence, the fortress had become their teacher and their warning. When the lessons reached the front lines, the air over Europe began to change. German pilots no longer rushed in bravely. They attacked like hunters, circling, waiting, then diving from the sun. The first formations of American bombers met the new tactics head-on and paid dearly. The fortress could still defend itself, but the skies were darker now, filled with smarter, faster predators. In the control rooms across England, commanders noticed the losses. Entire squadrons disappeared before radar could track them. The enemy had adapted, using knowledge stolen from one captured machine. The war in the air was no longer about courage. It was about learning faster than the other side. And both sides were now learning from the same teacher. The fortress crews began to whisper. They could feel it. Something had changed in the way the enemy fought. Attacks came from below, from the blind angles, from the edges of sunlight where the guns could not reach. The airmen tightened their formation, flying closer, trusting their fortress to shield them. But with each mission, more planes failed to return. In the mess halls, silence replaced laughter. The men would stare at empty seats, counting names no one wanted to say aloud. They still believed in their machine, but belief alone could not stop bullets. The fortress remained strong, but the skies had learned its weaknesses, and high above Europe, the war had entered a new and terrible phase. Over Germany's industrial heartland, the air filled with thunder once more. The American bombers returned, stronger, faster, flying tighter formations. The fortress crews had adapted too, rotating their turrets in practiced rhythm, scanning the clouds for the hunters below. When the German fighters struck, the bombers answered with a wall of fire, tracer lines weaving across the sky like threads of light. Each gunner knew his angle, his range, his moment to shoot. It was not chaos anymore, but coordination. Down below, the cities trembled as the sky burned with war. Civilians looked up at streaks of silver light moving across the clouds, hearing the echo of machine guns like distant drums. The fortress was no longer just a weapon. It had become a symbol of persistence. Each mission came with loss, but also with learning, and every return flight proved that even terror could be turned into precision. By the summer of 1943, both sides had changed. The fortress was no longer a mystery, but a challenge. Luftwaffe pilots refined their tactics daily, while American crews turned fear into discipline, each side learning from the other, rewriting the rules of survival. But deep inside German command, something darker began to grow. A realization that courage alone could not match production. In the smoke-filled rooms of the Berlin, officers whispered of numbers they could not overcome. Thousands of bombers, thousands more on the way, each one carrying the same power as the captured fortress. Hans Werner Lersche watched the reports pile up and felt a weight he could not shake. The sky, once their domain, was slipping away. And as the next chapter began, the Germans would learn that the true weapon of war was not the gun, but the factory. The first reports reached Berlin in midsummer, 1943. Charts covered the walls of the Luftwaffe's planning rooms, graphs, maps, production lines. The numbers seemed impossible. American factories were building thousands of bombers and replacing every loss in weeks, not months. Each new fortress rolling from the assembly line looked exactly like the one before it. Identical, efficient, unstoppable. German engineers stared in silence at the data. The Reich had brilliance, yes, but brilliance was slow. Perfection took time, and time was running out. Every day that passed, the Americans built more, every mistake corrected by machinery, not men. For the first time, officers began to understand that they were not fighting soldiers. They were fighting a system that never slept, never stopped, and never cared who it destroyed. Across the ocean, in the heart of America, a new kind of war was being fought. The battle was not in the skies or trenches, but inside factories of steel and fire. Women in uniforms worked beside men, welding, riveting, assembling wings that stretched like silver arms. Day and night, shifts rotated, lights never dimmed, and every hour another fortress was born. In those endless rows of machines, war became rhythm. Every sound, the hiss of steam, the clang of metal, the hum of belts, was a heartbeat of victory. This was not glory. It was discipline, a nation's will turned into motion. The workers never saw the battlefields, yet their hands shaped its outcome, and somewhere above them their creations flew, carrying the promise that numbers could win wars. At Rechlin, Hans Werner Lersche stood beside the captured fortress once more. He no longer saw it as an enemy machine, but as a mirror. It showed him what Germany could not become, not because of skill, but because of scale. He walked slowly around the bomber, touching the metal, tracing the rivets that had once seemed ordinary. Now he understood. They were symbols of something far greater. Inside the hangar, engineers spoke softly, their pride replaced by quiet fear. They realized that the war was no longer about who built the better weapon. It was about who could build it again, and again, and again. And as the lights flickered above them, they felt it, the weight of inevitability. A fortress could be copied, but an industry could not. In Detroit, the night never truly came. The factories glowed under floodlights, rows of sparks falling like stars. Machines hammered, drills screamed, and the hum of production echoed for miles. Each worker knew their role. Each shift replaced the last without pause. It was not chaos. It was orchestration, and every note produced a fortress. At the edge of the plant, a supervisor watched the endless stream of bombers moving down the line. He could feel the rhythm of victory in the vibration beneath his boots. The war had become a test of patience, and America had learned to wait and to build. Every bolt tightened was a promise. Every finished wing another heartbeat in a giant that never slept. For the first time in history, industry itself had become a soldier. At Rechlin, news arrived of fresh waves of bombers crossing the channel. Hans Werner Lersche read the reports quietly, his hand resting on the cold fuselage of the captured fortress. He understood now. The real enemy was not bravery, nor even the sky. It was the factory, the endless heartbeat of machines that never stopped. Germany could fight pilots, but not production, and with each passing month, the numbers became the true artillery of the war. He closed his notebook and whispered, "The machines have already decided who will win." Outside, the night was alive with distant thunder, not of storms, but of engines. If you've ever thought about how technology reshaped war itself, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts on what truly wins, courage or production. Because next, the skies above Germany will burn, and even the fortress will discover its limits. The dawn over Germany was no longer quiet. Hundreds of silver shapes moved across the sky, their engines blending into a single endless hum. The fortress fleets had returned, carrying fire for the cities below. Each plane carried bombs, fuel, and the weight of thousands of unseen hands that had built them. For the Germans on the ground, it was a sight both beautiful and terrifying. In the control towers, officers shouted coordinates. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, tracing orange lines through the clouds. But the formations did not break. They moved as one, steady, inevitable. The sky trembled with sound, a storm made by machines, not nature. And as the bombs began to fall, the world below turned red. The fortress had come full circle, no longer studied, but feared again. When the first bombs hit, the city of Hamburg lit the night like a second sun. Flames rose higher than church towers. Air currents twisted into firestorms that swallowed streets whole. The fortress crews watched from above, silent, detached, knowing that once they released their payload, the city's fate was sealed. Down below, fire moved faster than men could run. The heat turned metal into rivers. In the command posts, radio operators cried into static, reporting losses they could not count. Even the pilots above felt it, the weight of what they had done. The mission was success, but the victory tasted of ash. The sky over Germany burned not just with fire, but with the question, how much could be destroyed before something human was lost forever? When the crews landed, silence filled the airfields in England. The men stepped out covered in ash and sweat, their faces gray from smoke and exhaustion. No one cheered, No one spoke. They had done what was asked, but part of them stayed in the flames they left behind. Mechanics approached quietly, refueling, rearming, preparing for tomorrow's mission, as if nothing had happened. In the barracks that night, the fortress gunners sat in silence. They had seen cities vanish, and yet knew more would come. The fortress was a machine of survival, but the men inside were not made of metal. Each raid took something from them, something they could never replace. And though they still believed in duty, some began to dream of silence instead of victory. Across the continent, the sky wore a gray veil that never lifted. Rail yards burned, factories smoldered. Bridges lay in twisted lines of steel. Day after day, the fortress formations returned, steady, indifferent, inevitable. For the people below, time became a circle of sirens, shelters, and ash. For the pilots above, time became missions, maps, and long silent flights home. Both worlds moved together, bound by the math of war. In the German command rooms, officers traced black lines on maps, trying to predict the next wave. They knew the pattern now: industry first, rails next, then the cities that fed them. The fortress was no longer an aircraft in their minds. It was a metronome. Each strike fell on the beat, and with each beat, the country lost another step. The fires climbed into the clouds and left a stain that even rain could not erase. And still, the engines kept their rhythm. When the raids paused, the quiet felt unnatural. The streets were empty except for ash and footprints, windows without glass, doors without homes. From high above, the fortress crews saw only gray, a color made from smoke and regret. On the ground, people searched for names written on scraps of paper, and for the small ordinary things that make a life. Even victory sounded different now, like a bell struck under water. At Rechlin, Hans Werner Lersche stood beside the captured fortress one more time. He touched the metal and felt only cold. He had watched an idea turn into a storm, and the storm turn into habit. He wondered what the future would call this season of fire. Then he looked east, where another story waited in secret. Because soon, the fortress would serve a different purpose in German hands, and the name of a unit, quiet and hidden, would begin to echo. By the autumn of 1943, the captured fortress at Rechlin had changed. Its silver skin now bore black crosses, its American markings covered by new paint. Under orders from Berlin, the bomber would fly again, this time under a different flag. Few knew why, only that the mission was secret, and those who asked too many questions were moved elsewhere. Hans Werner Lersche watched the technicians repaint the fuselage, his expression unreadable. The fortress looked the same, but something inside it felt wrong. It had become a ghost of both nations, a weapon without a side. As the engines started once more, the hangar filled with that familiar thunder, but this time the sound no longer meant pride, only silence and obedience. The men who arrived at Rechlin did not wear standard uniforms. Their badges were unmarked, their names absent from any list. They spoke quietly, carried sealed envelopes, and answered to no command the engineers could name. Whispers spread. KG 200, the unit that flew where others could not. They studied the fortress in silence, measuring its range, its endurance, its deception. This was not about combat, it was about disguise. Soon the fortress would carry false signals, fly into enemy airspace, and vanish again into clouds. Germany had found a new use for its captured prize, not as a weapon of power, but as a weapon of illusion. And in this illusion, the line between truth and lies began to fade. The new crew arrived at night, brought in by truck under blackout covers. They signed no documents, received no ranks, and were told only this: they would fly for the fatherland, but never be seen doing it. Each man had a past that could not be spoken, a record that had been erased. They trained in silence, learning the fortress systems, its controls, its weight in the air. Their mission was simple and impossible: to fly American planes deep into Allied skies, to deliver spies, to gather data, and to mislead the enemy's radar. The fortress became their mask, and they wore it with precision. At night, under pale moonlight, the engines whispered to life again, and somewhere above the clouds, the line between nations disappeared. For months, the fortress flew under false stars. Each mission began the same: a night takeoff, a silence over the radio, and a vanishing into the clouds. Sometimes it dropped spies into fields in France. Sometimes it broadcast false codes to confuse Allied radars. But mostly it existed only as rumor, seen by those who should not have seen it, and denied by those who knew too much. When it returned, no reports were filed, only whispers followed. It was said that the fortress could appear as friend or foe, that pilots who saw it sometimes hesitated. In the war's chaos, truth became fragile, and deception became survival. Even among its crew, few knew where their flights began, or where they truly ended. The sky had become a mirror, and no one was sure which reflection was real. By the final months of 1944, the fortress was more legend than aircraft. Some said it was shot down, others said it still flew, changing shapes, changing sides. Hans Werner Lersche never confirmed what became of it. He simply said, "Some ghosts prefer the sky." The unit KG-200 faded back into secrecy, its files sealed, its pilots erased. Only fragments remained, stories told by both sides, about a fortress that belonged to everyone and to no one. In the years after the war, pieces of its story surfaced again, enough to remind the world that even machines could carry mysteries. If stories like this fascinate you, share this video with someone who loves the hidden parts of history. Because next, we'll leave the battlefields behind and follow the men who came home, carrying the war inside their silence. The guns went quiet, and for the first time in years, the sky over Europe was empty. No engines, no fire, only wind passing through broken glass and empty streets. Men who had once shouted orders now spoke in whispers, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. The war had ended, yet no one felt victorious. At Rechlin, the hangars were silent. The captured fortress stood alone, its paint fading under rain. It had survived battles, secrets, and lies, but not time. The men who once studied it had gone, leaving only echoes of engines that would never start again. And in that silence, history exhaled, a long, tired breath. Years passed, and the fortress became a relic. Children played near its rusting frame, unaware of the sky it once ruled. Inside its hollow body, dust gathered where voices once shouted, where courage and fear shared the same breath. Each rivet, each faded marking, held the memory of men who had lived too close to history's fire. Visitors came sometimes, historians, veterans, strangers. They would touch the metal and feel something cold, but human. The machine had outlived the war, yet it still carried its scars, and as sunlight passed through the broken windows, it glimmered softly, as if remembering. The war had ended long ago, but its lessons still drifted above us. That power without understanding becomes destruction, that courage without compassion becomes cruelty, and that even the mightiest machines depend on the fragile hearts of the men who build and fly them. If this story brought you something to think about, something to feel, take a moment to subscribe, not just to hear another tale, but to remember that history still speaks, softly, through the voices that refuse to forget. As night returns, the world sleeps again. But somewhere, in a museum, a hangar, or a memory, the hum of engines still lingers, not as thunder, but as a whisper, reminding us of what was lost and what was learned. Every war ends, but its echoes remain, carried by those who listen. So if you close your eyes tonight and hear the faint sound of wings in the dark, know that they are not ghosts, but reminders, that even through fire, humanity endures, and the sky, no matter how it burns, will always clear again.